I don't think I have ever been at an event like this. I have spoken in just about every community in North America over the last 35 years of my career, and I've done major gifts and annual events and all this, and I don't ever remember an event like this. Those speakers were great. And there's something different about, I don't want to be cynical and critique other communities, but there really is something different about turning this into a sacred theater today because of the kind of talks you heard and, hiring someone to simply entertain you. There's a really major difference. And sometimes when you live in your own community, you don't have distance to be able to see it. I am telling you, as someone who travels 125,000 miles a year and travels around North America, I have never seen something like this in an evening like this. So, kol hakavod to you. So I want to imagine leaping Louis Gold. You know who he was? Oh my God, you don't know who he was? He was the first Jewish settler in Vancouver in the 1870s, and he was called Leaping Louis Gold because he was very, very short and very, very stout, and he was harassed by bigots and prejudice, and he developed this ability when people were really harassing him to leap and give someone an uppercut and knock them out and knock the bully out. So you can look it up, you can Google it. I wonder what Leaping Louis Gold would think if he was sitting here tonight. You know that 127 years ago, this week, was the first public high holiday service in Vancouver. It was in the Nights of Pythias. I wonder if we sort of went in a time machine and brought them here and they sat here, what would they think? Oh, the first 85 Jews in 1891, if we just transported them and they sat here, what would they think if we told them what Jewish life was like in 2018? I imagine they would, if we really described it, they'd think it was messianic. Now, we know it's messy, not messianic. But really, that's the context I want to create tonight. We don't have any problems that are not the consequence of blessing. That is not the case with Louis Gold. That is not the case with the Oppenheimer brothers who came here in the late 1800s. That is not the case for the people who built the very first institutions here. Every single problem we have is a consequence of blessing, is a consequence of abundance. But to create meaning and purpose and community in a context of abundance is really different than in a context of scarcity. The challenges of power and freedom and affluence and integration are really, really different than the challenge of powerlessness and persecution and poverty. It calls for incredible internal sense of responsibility because it's not generated from the outside in. It has to be generated from the inside out, and that is new. That is new in general for most human beings, and it's very, very new for the Jewish people. We're living through one of the greatest demographic shifts in the history of the planet, one of the greatest technological shifts in the history of the planet, one of the great transformational moments in the history of the planet. We are literally beginning to redefine what the species called human is. And since we are embedded in that species called human, not surprisingly, we're redefining what it means to be Jewish too. And that's very, very unnerving to have all that change. How to manage that change, how to manage the loss that comes with that change. People are mixing and blending and bending and switching their identities. People are getting the resources to create identities, the likes of which we've never seen before. There's an explosion of voices, an explosion of possibilities and capacities. My God, have more access to Jewish texts and to the wisdom texts of the planet here than any human being had in their entire lifetime. The entire Jewish classic tradition I have in my phone. Any teacher of Jewish wisdom, any teacher of any wisdom tradition on the planet who's a great teacher, I can have within 10 seconds. That means everybody gets the ability to construct their identities in new ways. And so, of course, we have crazy mixtures. And for the first time, we have something called disassimilation. You still worry about assimilation? That's over. We have disassimilation. You know what disassimilation is? That Jews, by the way, it's all people, but I'm talking about Jews. Jews now do not have to disidentify with being Jewish, no matter who they marry, no matter how they act, no matter what behaviors they have, no matter what authority says yes or no. That's brand new. And so, not surprisingly, we have this sort of explosion of ways of being Jewish and ways of not being Jewish, in which people still identify as Jewish. 94% of North American Jews are proud of being Jewish. Think about that. We have no Jewish identity problem. That is my first takeaway for you. There is no Jewish identity problem. There is a problem about the relationship between people's Jewish identities and actually doing anything Jewish. Now, that's a fascinating problem. Because it used to be that we had a problem in Jewish pride. We had a problem in people not identifying Jewish. Now we have people who Madonna thinks she's Jewish. Steve Colbert gets on TV, and he does during Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, during the 10 days of repentance, right now, he puts a phone on his desk, and he says, I'm not Jewish, but I have a lot of Jewish friends, and I want to explain to you, between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Jews have to ask people that they offended, right? They have to ask for forgiveness, or they're not inscribed in the book of life, and then they can't sleep, he says. And he teaches 4 million people watch that show a night. And he puts a phone on the desk, and he puts a number, 1-800-OOPS-Jew. Ding-a-ling, ding-a-ling, the phone rings, and it's Joe Lieberman. He says, oh, a senator, an ex-senator. You can Google all this. Now, what's that about? What does that mean? He taught more people about repentance and about that you cannot get God's atonement without getting atonement from other human beings, forgiveness from other human beings. He taught more people that in one evening than all the rabbis in the world taught all the people this year in Aseret Yemei Teshuvah. And that's not a critique of rabbis. I'm a 7th, 8th generation rabbi. It means something is radically shifting. Something is opening up. And on top of that, we're trying to figure out what it means to be a human being again. And we're positioned perfectly if we would stop being so unbelievably anxious and obsessive about our own continuity. Right now, we are at a point in which, because of cognitive augmentation and physical augmentation, that we're making human beings capable of being better at everything. But the question is, will we make better human beings? That's the Jewish question. That's the religious and spiritual and wisdom question. And the more we obsess about identity, the less we actually look at this tradition and figure out what wisdom and practices can be mined that will actually help us flourish and expand our moral imaginations as human beings. That's the challenge right now. I want to leave you with 2 psychological shifts leadership has to make. And I don't say this to everybody. It's because I'm told that these are the people in this room who are the leadership of Vancouver. And you know, it's always been a small group of people who are leadership. There were 60 prophets in the entire biblical tradition. 60. There were 300 rabbis in the entire Talmud listed. There were 200 people at the first Zionist Congress. So it's not that there aren't enough people here. It's when we do our job in a richer, more engaging way, there'll be more people. So 2 takeaways on the psychological shift. 1, the issue is no longer how do I make Jews better Jews, good Jews? It's how do I ensure that Jewish wisdom and practice, how Torah works to help anybody flourish. And if Torah works to help anybody flourish, everything will be okay. And the more we obsess about identity to Jews who are proud of their Jewishness, the more we have nothing to say to them. And that's really a challenge. And psychological shift, too, is it's not about preserving the community. And this is subtle. It's about community being a means, not an end. And that's a new challenge. When one's under attack, when one's powerless, when one's poverty-stricken, when one's persecuted, the very survival of the community is what gives you strength. When one has power and freedom and affluence and integration into the general society and into the global community, the community is not needed for safety. It is needed to be able to be the space where one learns the wisdom to engage the world fully and contribute to the world massively. And that is a brand new way of thinking about community. Community is means, not end. And every time we think of it an end, we're in trouble. And every time we think about Jewish identity as an end, we're in trouble. And that changes the metrics. That changes the measure. We have to stop measuring whether a person has a mezuzah on the door and instead measure whether putting a mezuzah on the door actually makes any difference about what's happening in one's home. We have to stop measuring whether someone lights candles on Shabbos and begin to measure whether if you light candles on Shabbos, does it bring any new light in your home? We have to stop measuring how many people show up on Rosh Hashanah and instead measure, does shofar blowing make us more awake to reality itself? We have to stop measuring how many people are in shul to say Kol Nidre and instead measure, if we say Kol Nidre, do we keep our promises? Do we keep our vows? Do we make our pledges and keep our pledges? And to the extent that Torah, its practices and wisdom actually work to help human beings flourish, this will be a renaissance in Jewish history. But that is a radical shift. And those 2 psychological shifts require 3 things that leadership has to do. The first thing leadership has to do is it has to push resources out from a centralized model to a distributed model. You cannot say every human being is of infinite value and every human being is an image of God and then decide how other people should live Jewishly because they're not living in our neighborhood but they need our support. And I know that's hard. And if I'm 60, so I can say this. If you're over 60, it's almost impossible. Because what we want to do is recapitulate ourselves. But the next generation and our grandchildren's Jewishness is going to be as different from our Judaism as our Judaism is from our grandparents and great-grandparents. Louis Gold wouldn't recognize our Jewishness. But he'd understand that in discontinuity is where continuity happens. Zionism was the most deeply discontinuous movement in the history of the Jewish people, and it turned out to assure continuity. The day school is a deeply discontinuous invention, and it's central to the continuity of the Jewish people. The denominations are deeply discontinuous with the Jewish past, and they've turned out to be central in the modern experience for the future of Judaism. Discontinuity, innovation, unbundling. In fact, the more that you can stimulate, especially in the areas where Jews are moving and young Jews are moving, which I know is an issue. It's an issue in every community. The accessibility and affordability, which is not only about a home, but the accessibility and affordability of being Jewish itself, to have access to the resources. Our job is to push them out, not to husband them, and not to measure people on our own measure. But it's the Jewish stuff that they're creating and that's emerging. Is it working for them? And the second thing that we're going to have to get good at leadership is pluralism. We need a robust and radical pluralism. It's the central question on the planet today. Can we live together with boundaries that are permeable and fluid? And if we can't figure out how to live together, and that's what makes this more sacred than any other gathering in community, because here you have all types of Jews, and here you have hawks and doves, and here you have traditionalists and less traditionalists, and liberal and conservative. When we go daven, it's not like that. When we go to our synagogues, it's not like that. But in these spaces, it's the Rosh Hashanah of the collective. And the Rosh Hashanah of the collective may be actually more important than the Rosh Hashanah that actually coronates God as sovereign. And I say that humbly. Because it turns out, as Ray Kurzweil, I'll tell you a story and I'll finish. Here's Ray Kurzweil. Ray Kurzweil is the most important, has the more patents than anybody else in North America. So Ray Kurzweil is at Google, he's head of Google Ideas or Google Think. He's a cousin of my wife, so like I feel a little pride. Okay, so I hear Ray Kurzweil speak a couple of years ago, and he speaks about this moment of singularity in 2045, 2050. The human, artificial intelligence, machine intelligence is all going to come together, and there's going to be literally new species of human, right? Of sort of this organic and biological and artificial coming together, artificial and machine coming together. It's remarkable. We'll live forever, et cetera, et cetera. Somebody gets up and raises their hand and says, Ray, do you believe in God? The place is absolutely quiet. Ray doesn't make a move. Like this, he goes, not yet. Guy says, does God exist? Ray goes, not yet. What Ray is saying is we're moving into a period in which we are becoming the very gods that we imagined. And now the question is, will we live up to the very gods that imagined us? This is a new moment in human history, and we have an opportunity. The world needs us right now. The world needs us not to obsess about identity and not to obsess about the preservation of community, but to actually make community a means and Jewish wisdom and practice a path, a derech of human flourishing. And the only way to do that is push resources out. The only way to do that is to be radically pluralist, including things we don't like. You have to love the parts of Jewish that you hate. And if you can't do that, you cannot be a leader in the next phase of Jewish history. You can be an advocate for some particular part of Judaism, but you cannot be a leader of the Jewish people. You have to love that which you hate. After all, Hillel could argue Shammai's Torah in his academy before he argued his own Torah. That's what we have to be able to do. And last, the most critical thing for leadership to do is to model now. Never before has authenticity been such a significant feature of the human experience. Brands can go under with one mistake. And I don't mean to be crass, but Judaism is just one more brand. It happens to be an ancient brand with wisdom that can actually transform the world, with a vision of blessing from the beginning that it could transform the world, with practices and holidays that could be accessible and usable to anyone to make them flourish. But it's leadership in every single act that represents every piece of teaching and preaching. And so if we say, Al tashlichenu leit zikna, if we say, don't cast me out when I'm old, and there is not enough money to take care of our elderly, it's better not to pray it because it's idolatry and it destroys the brand. If we're teaching and saying, Baruch atah Hashem anta kol, you feed everybody, and we don't feed everyone we can feed, it's better not to say it because it's strip mining this tradition. If we say, Avinu malkeinu, if we sing that and are not humble, but are arrogant about our success and wealth, then it's better not to sing it because we strip mine the brand. Now here's what you get if you can make the psychological shifts on identity and community. And here's what we get if we actually can push resources out, be robustly pluralist, and model at levels we never had to model before the very tradition we love. Here's what we get. 150 years from now, 127 years from now, I don't know if it'll be in this theater, But there'll be people talking about the Vancouver Jewish community between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And they'll talk about a time 260 years ago of Louis Gold, leaping Louis Gold. And then they'll talk about 130 years ago. They'll talk about us. And we didn't have to leap to be able to protect ourselves from people who wanted to kill us. We had to leap into the world with our wisdom and practice so that we could fundamentally do what we were supposed to do from Abraham's initial moment, to be a blessing unto this world. And they'll say about us, we lived in one of the heroic ages of Jewish history. Shana Tova.